Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Savannah, Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The air hung heavy over Chatham County in the summer of 1828. Not just with the usual Georgia heat that pressed down on cotton fields like a hot iron, but with something else, a tension that crawled beneath the skin of Savannah's orderly society. Something was shifting in the shadows of the oak trees draped in Spanish moss, something that would later be systematically erased from official records. The Blackwood plantation stood 17 miles northwest of Savannah proper, accessible via the old Augusta Road, before turning onto a private lane that stretched for nearly 2 miles. The property spread across 800 acres of prime Georgia soil, bounded by the Savannah River to the north. It was neither the largest nor the wealthiest plantation in Chatham County, but it was notable for what some locals called its unusual management practices. The plantation belonged to Thomas Blackwood, a third-generation plantation owner whose grandfather had established the property in 1769. According to county records still preserved in the Chatham Historical Society archives, the plantation housed approximately 127 enslaved persons at the time of the events in question. The main house was a 2-story colonial structure with 6 white columns supporting the front portico, a modest display compared to some of the more ostentatious homes of Savannah's elite. Behind the main house stood the overseer's cottage, the stables, and beyond that, hidden from view of any visitors, the quarters. What makes the Blackwood case particularly unsettling is not what happened, strange as it was, but how thoroughly it was concealed afterward. Were it not for 3 separate sources that survived by mere chance, we might never have known about the events that transpired over those 13 days in August of 1828. The first source is a partial journal belonging to Dr. James Merritt, a physician from Savannah who was called to the plantation on August 4th. The journal, discovered during a renovation of an old pharmacy building on Broughton Street in 1954, contains 12 pages of increasingly disturbed observations. The second source is a series of letters written by Elizabeth Kurthers, the sister-in-law of Thomas Blackwood, who was visiting from Charleston during that summer. These letters, addressed to her husband, were never sent and were found in 1967, sealed in the false bottom of a traveling desk that had been sold at auction decades earlier. The third and perhaps most revealing source is a transcript of testimony given by Samuel Reed, the overseer of the neighboring Marshall plantation, during a closed inquiry conducted by county officials in September 1828. This transcript was misfiled among land dispute records and discovered by a graduate student researching property boundaries in 1961. The document was subsequently removed from public access, but not before it had been partially transcribed by the student. From these fragmented sources, a disturbing narrative emerges of what appears to have been a carefully planned uprising led by an enslaved man known only as Isaiah in official records. What distinguished this event from other resistance efforts of the era was its methodical nature and the complete silence that surrounded it afterward. According to Dr. Merritt's journal, he was summoned to the plantation by an urgent message claiming that Thomas Blackwood was suffering from a high fever and delirium. Upon arriving, he noted that the usual activities of the plantation seemed strangely altered. No fieldwork was underway, despite the hour and season. The doctor was met by Isaiah, who identified himself as the master's personal servant and who explained that Mr. Blackwood had taken ill 3 days prior and was now confined to his bed. Dr. Merritt described Isaiah as uncommonly composed and articulate, noting that he spoke with authority unusual for his station. The doctor was led to the main house, where he found Thomas Blackwood indeed confined to bed, feverish and semi-conscious. What struck the doctor as odd was that there were no other white persons present, neither Blackwood's wife Catherine, their 2 children, nor the overseer, a man named Harold Prentice. When questioned about their absence, Isaiah explained that Mrs. Blackwood had taken the children to visit family in Augusta just before the master's illness. and that Mr. Prentice had ridden to a neighboring plantation 2 days prior to borrow medicine and had not yet returned. Dr. Merritt noted that Blackwood was being tended by 2 enslaved women who administered care with unusual autonomy. What the doctor could not have known then was that, according to Samuel Reed's later testimony, Overseer Prentice had been dead for at least 3 days by that point. Reed testified that Prentice's body was eventually discovered in a drainage ditch at the boundary between the Blackwood and Marshall properties, though this fact was never recorded in any official documents from the time. Elizabeth Kurthers' letters provide insight into the conditions that preceded these events. Having arrived at the plantation in late July, she described in detail the unusual dynamics she observed. "Thomas runs his affairs in a manner that would shock many of our acquaintances," she wrote. "The one called Isaiah appears to function as a second overseer, though of course this is never stated explicitly. He alone among the servants speaks directly to Thomas, even in company, and carries keys to various storerooms. Catherine seems unsettled by the arrangement, but offers no objection I can discern." In another letter, Elizabeth noted, "There is something in the air here that distresses me deeply. The house feels watched from within. At dinner, I observed 3 of the house servants exchanging glances when Thomas spoke of his plans for expanding the north field. Later, I heard voices from Thomas's study, his and another's speaking as equals, though when I entered he was alone." The atmosphere, Elizabeth described, grew increasingly tense as July turned to August. She mentioned that Thomas had become irritable, suffering from headaches and stomach distress. "Catherine believes they are being poisoned slowly," she wrote on August 2nd, though she dares not say by whom. "She has taken to preparing their food herself, though this has caused unmistakable offense among the kitchen staff." It was on August 3rd that Elizabeth wrote her most disturbing letter, which she never completed. "Something is terribly wrong. Thomas collapsed at dinner, his speech slurred and eyes unfocused. The one called Isaiah took charge immediately, directing the others with a composure that seemed rehearsed, as though they had been waiting for this moment. Catherine wanted to send for Dr. Merritt immediately, but Isaiah insisted it was merely heat exhaustion and that the master should rest overnight before calling for medical assistance. What alarmed me was not his contradiction of Catherine's wishes, but her quiet acquiescence to his judgment. The letter continues. "I retired early, but was wakened by the sound of movement throughout the house. Footsteps in the hallway, doors opening and closing, voices murmuring. When I attempted to leave my room, I found the door would not open. It had been secured from the outside. Through my window, I could see figures moving about the grounds carrying lanterns. There was no shouting, no chaos, only purposeful movement, as though following a plan long established. I am writing this by candlelight, unsure if morning will bring relief or..." The letter ends there. Dr. Merritt's journal picks up the narrative. After treating Thomas Blackwood on August 4th, he was preparing to return to Savannah when Isaiah suggested he remain overnight, as the road was not safe after dark. The doctor agreed, noting that something in his manner made refusal seem unwise. That night, Merritt wrote that he heard a gathering of some sort taking place in the cleared area between the main house and the quarters. From his window, he could see dozens of lanterns and movements, but could not make out what was transpiring. The following morning, Merritt found the plantation functioning in an oddly normal fashion, with fieldwork underway and meals being served. However, he noted, "There is no white authority present, yet everything proceeds as though under direction. The man Isaiah moves between house and field, giving instructions that are followed without question." Dr. Merritt's growing unease is evident in his increasingly hurried handwriting. He attempted to depart that day, but discovered that his horse had been moved to a distant pasture. When he demanded to leave, Isaiah politely informed him that Mr. Blackwood's condition required continued medical attention and that it would be irresponsible for the doctor to leave. Merritt remained at the plantation for 6 more days, during which he documented a community functioning entirely under the direction of the enslaved persons themselves, with Isaiah as the clear authority. What makes this account particularly remarkable is that there was no violence described, no retribution against the ill Blackwood, only a complete reversal of authority. "They have not harmed anyone," Merritt wrote on August 9th. which perhaps explains why I myself remain unharmed. Yet I am unmistakably a prisoner here. Isaiah visits Blackwood's sick room twice daily, speaking to him in low tones, though the man remains largely insensible. I have been permitted to treat him with standard remedies, but I suspect his tea is being laced with something that maintains his semi-conscious state. According to the doctor's journal, on August 10th, a visitor approached the plantation, a merchant who regularly traded with Blackwood. The doctor observed from a window as Isaiah met the man at the edge of the property, spoke with him briefly, and sent him away. The merchant left without protest, seemingly satisfied with whatever explanation was provided. They have established a boundary around the plantation that no one crosses. I wonder how many have been turned away, and what stories are circulating in Savannah about the sudden inaccessibility of the Blackwood household. The most disturbing entry comes on August 11th, when Merritt wrote, "Today I was permitted to join their council." He described being escorted after nightfall to the overseer's cottage, where he found a gathering of 12 enslaved persons seated around the table where Prentice would normally have taken his meals. Isaiah presided at the head of the table. They discussed the management of the plantation as though it were a long-established democracy, Merritt wrote. Matters of crop rotation, distribution of food stores, and maintenance of equipment were debated and resolved by consensus. No mention was made of their legal status or the outside world. It was as though the plantation had become a self-contained commonwealth with its own laws and governance. When Merritt asked directly what they intended to do with him and with the Blackwoods, Isaiah reportedly replied, "Nothing that has not already been done. You are witnessing the correction of an unnatural order." The doctor's journal ends abruptly after that meeting. The next documentation comes from Samuel Reed's testimony, in which he described being asked by several neighboring plantation owners to investigate the Blackwood property after no communication had been received for over a week. Reed testified that he rode to the plantation on August 16th with 2 other overseers. They found the gate locked and the entrance unwatched. After forcing their way in and riding to the main house, they discovered it completely empty. "Not a soul remained," Reed stated, "neither white nor colored. The house stood as though its occupants had stepped out momentarily. Dishes on the table, clothes in the wardrobes, ledgers open in the study, but not one person remained on the entire 800 acres. A search of the property revealed no signs of violence. The only unusual discovery was in the plantation cemetery, where the searchers found 3 fresh graves. They were not marked, but appeared to have been dug and filled recently. Reed testified that they did not disturb these graves, assuming they contained the bodies of Blackwood and his family. What followed was perhaps the most unusual aspect of the entire affair. According to Reed's testimony, within 2 days of their discovery, officials from Savannah arrived at the plantation, accompanied by representatives from several prominent families. After a brief inspection, a decision was apparently reached. No investigation would be announced. No search would be conducted for the missing enslaved persons. The matter would be handled privately. Reed testified that he was told the official story would be that Thomas Blackwood had sold the plantation and relocated to Florida with his family and property. The plantation was indeed sold within a month to a cousin of Blackwood's who had recently arrived from Virginia, and operations resumed under new ownership by October of that same year. As for what happened to the 127 enslaved persons from the Blackwood plantation, no record exists of their recapture or sighting. The most likely explanation would seem to be that they attempted to reach the northern states or perhaps Spanish Florida. A harbormaster's log from Charleston, dated September 3, 1828, notes the departure of a merchant vessel bound for Haiti with cargo and passengers. The log includes the unusual detail that the passengers appeared to be voluntary colonists seeking new settlement rather than the usual deportees. The harbormaster noted that the passengers, numbering upwards of 100 souls, were accompanied by a spokesman of uncommon dignity who presented papers showing they had been legally manumitted and were traveling as free persons. However, such a large group traveling together would almost certainly have been noticed and reported. One final piece of evidence suggests an alternative possibility. No record exists of who signed those manumission papers. The ship, the Deliverance, reached Haiti according to port records in Cap Haïtien, but no further documentation of the passengers has been found. The Blackwood incident represents a unique case in the history of resistance to slavery, not just for what occurred, but for how completely it was erased from official records. The closed nature of the plantation system made such erasure possible. With no survivors willing to speak and powerful interests motivated to maintain silence, the events at the Blackwood plantation became little more than whispers. In 1968, an archaeological survey was conducted at the former plantation site as part of a development project. Workers uncovered the remains of the overseer's cottage foundation, which showed signs of having been burned at some point after the original structure was abandoned. Beneath the floorboards of what would have been the main room, they discovered a small metal box containing a handwritten document. The document, now preserved in the Georgia Historical Society archives, appears to be a constitution of sorts, setting forth principles for self-governance. It begins, "We hold as self-evident the dignity of all persons created by God, and establish herein a covenant of mutual protection and responsibility." The document is signed simply, "The Free Community of Blackwood," followed by rows of marks and initials, 127 in total. Perhaps most unsettling of all is the discovery made during the examination of Thomas Blackwood's business records, which were preserved by the family that subsequently purchased the plantation. According to ledger entries from 1827, Blackwood had taken out substantial loans using his land and property as collateral. He was deeply in debt by early 1828 and, based on correspondence with his creditors, was likely facing imminent financial ruin. This raises the disturbing possibility that the events at the Blackwood plantation may have been more complex than a simple uprising. Some historians have suggested that what occurred might have been a negotiated arrangement. Blackwood's silence and cooperation in exchange for his life, while those formerly enslaved by him executed an escape plan that had perhaps been years in the making. We will never know the full truth of what transpired during those 13 days in August. The graves discovered on the property were eventually excavated during the 1960s development project, but were found to contain only personal items, clothing, books, and small possessions, rather than human remains. A symbolic burial, perhaps, of lives left behind. The Blackwood plantation house itself stood vacant for many years before burning to the ground in 1912. Local legend claims that no one would live there because voices could be heard in the empty rooms at night, not cries of anguish, but the measured tones of people in quiet conversation, planning something just beyond the listener's understanding. Today, a suburban development covers most of the former plantation land. Residents occasionally report finding unusual items when digging in their gardens, fragments of handmade pottery with intricate patterns, iron tools modified from their original purpose, small carved wooden figures. Each object a whisper from the past, a fragment of a story systematically erased but never completely silenced. Some say that on August nights, when the air hangs heavy with humidity and the cicadas fall suddenly quiet, you can hear footsteps moving with purpose across land that once knew bondage, then briefly, freedom. What became of Isaiah and the others who left on the deliverance? There is a small community in northern Haiti where the residents speak an unusual dialect that combines Gula, French, and Haitian Creole. They maintain traditions unlike those of their neighbors, and the eldest among them tells stories of ancestors who reversed the order of things and carried their freedom across the water. Perhaps that is where the true ending lies. Not in records deliberately obscured, not in graves symbolically filled, but in stories passed down through generations, preserving the memory of 13 days when those deemed property became the authors of their own constitution. Or perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Blackwood case is how easily it was erased, how a complete reversal of the established order could be made to disappear from history with the right connections and the right story. It raises the question of how many other such incidents may have occurred, only to be systematically removed from our collective memory, leaving behind nothing but fragments and whispers that something once happened that was not supposed to be possible. The soil of Georgia holds many secrets. Some are still waiting to be discovered. Others, perhaps, are better left undisturbed. In 1959, a historian named Joseph Wilkins from Emory University began researching unusual property transfers in Chatham County during the early 19th century. His interest was purely academic, patterns of land ownership among the planter class and how they changed during economic downturns. He had no intention of uncovering anything related to the Blackwood plantation, yet in the county archives, Wilkins discovered a curious pattern. In the months following August 1828, there were 7 other plantations in Georgia and South Carolina that changed ownership under circumstances similar to Blackwoods. In each case, the official record stated that the owner had relocated to Florida, to the Caribbean, or back to Europe, and had sold their holdings to relatives or close associates. In each case, the transaction occurred without the principal ever appearing in person to sign the documents. Most tellingly, each of these plantations had been operating at a financial loss for at least 2 years prior to the transfer, and each had an unusually high ratio of enslaved persons to white overseers, situations where control depended more heavily on compliance than on force. Wilkins published his findings in a small academic journal in 1960, suggesting that the pattern might indicate a series of financial failures that wealthy families had disguised as voluntary relocations to avoid social embarrassment. His paper received little attention, and he soon moved on to other research interests. 3 months after publication, Wilkins reported that someone had broken into his university office. Nothing was taken except his research notes on the property transfers. When he attempted to access the original county records again, he was informed they had been moved to a special archive requiring specific authorization for access, authorization he was unable to obtain despite his academic credentials. In 1961, Wilkins accepted a position at a university in California. According to colleagues, he never returned to his research on Georgia plantations. His academic focus shifted entirely to 20th century economic history, and he never again published on the antebellum period. When contacted by later researchers interested in his findings, he reportedly declined to discuss the matter, saying only that some corners of history are better left unexplored. What Wilkins may have unknowingly documented was evidence not of isolated incidents, but of a network, a system of communication and coordination among enslaved communities that operated beneath the surface of the plantation system. The Blackwood case might not have been unique, but rather one successful example of a resistance strategy employed elsewhere with varying degrees of success. Dr. Merritt's journal, though ending abruptly on August 11th, contains one final entry that was originally overlooked because it was written in the back cover of the journal rather than in sequence with the other entries. Dated simply later, it reads, "Isaiah spoke to me privately after the council meeting. He knows I have been keeping this account. Rather than demand I surrender it, he asked that I preserve it accurately, but keep it hidden until the proper time. When I asked when that might be, he said, 'When enough of the others have succeeded.' I do not know what he meant by this, but the implication of coordinated actions elsewhere is troubling. He then told me something I find difficult to comprehend, that Blackwood himself had been part of the arrangement from the beginning. This final entry suggests a level of complexity to the events that goes beyond a simple narrative of uprising. If Merritt's account is accurate, it raises the possibility that Thomas Blackwood, facing financial ruin, might have entered into some form of agreement with Isaiah, perhaps the only bargain available to preserve his life and possibly secure some portion of his assets. Further evidence supporting this theory emerged in 1966, when a descendant of Thomas Blackwood, living in Brazil, contacted the Georgia Historical Society. The descendant possessed family letters indicating that Thomas, Catherine, and their children had indeed survived the events of 1828 and had relocated first to Haiti and later to Brazil, where they lived under a different name. According to these letters, the family had maintained sporadic contact with relatives in the United States, but had never returned. The letters made no explicit mention of the circumstances surrounding their departure from Georgia. However, one passage is suggestive. Our new circumstances, though reduced from our former station, provide a freedom from certain moral burdens that weighed heavily upon father's conscience in the former life. He often remarks that our true liberation occurred simultaneously with those for whom he once bore responsibility. If authentic, these letters suggest an arrangement even more extraordinary than a successful uprising, a mutual liberation, negotiated rather than seized, that freed both the enslaved and the enslaver from an institution that degraded all who participated in it. In the Haitian community mentioned earlier, local tradition holds that their settlement was founded by a mixed group of freed persons and a white family who arrived together and established a new social order based on equality. The settlement's oldest building, a stone meeting house dating to the 1830s, bears an inscription above its door that reads in Creole, "Here all persons stand equal before God and each other." Perhaps most intriguing is a record discovered in a Cap Haitian notary's office in 1969. It documents the purchase of land by a community trust, represented by a man identified as Isaiah Freeman and co-signed by Thomas Black. The land described corresponds to the location of the settlement. The document is dated November 1828, just 3 months after the events at the Blackwood plantation. What are we to make of this fragmentary evidence? The historical record remains deliberately obscured, with powerful interests of the time ensuring that whatever occurred at the Blackwood plantation would not serve as an example to others. Yet the traces that remain suggest something more complex than the typical narrative of resistance and retribution. Isaiah, whose full name we may never know, appears to have orchestrated not just an uprising, but a complete reimagining of the possible. Rather than seeking vengeance against his oppressors, he seems to have offered them a choice: face ruin alone, or join in creating a new reality where all might live with dignity. This is perhaps why the story was so thoroughly suppressed. An uprising could be explained away as the actions of the desperate or the violent. It could be used to justify even harsher systems of control. But a successful negotiation between the enslaved and their enslaver, one that resulted in mutual benefit and a new community based on equality, represented a far greater threat to the institution of slavery. It suggested an alternative path, a possibility that the system was not inevitable but chosen, and that it could be unchosen. In 1860, a minister in Boston recorded in his diary a meeting with an elderly gentleman, originally from Haiti, but now residing in Canada, who shared with me an extraordinary account of his early life. The minister wrote that his visitor claimed to have been born enslaved in Georgia, but had departed that state under unusual circumstances, as part of a community that had, through means he would not specify, secured their freedom collectively. The minister noted, "What struck me most about the gentleman's account was not the fact of his escape, remarkable though it was, but his insistence that their liberation had involved no bloodshed. We found another way," he told me. When I pressed him on what this meant, he said only, "We appealed not to our master's fear, but to his ruin, and offered him the choice between destruction alone or salvation together." Could this elderly gentleman have been Isaiah himself, or one of those who left with him? The timing would be plausible. A man in his 20s or 30s in 1828 would have been in his 60s by 1860. The location also fits with other evidence, suggesting that at least some of the group eventually relocated from Haiti to Canada. What became of the others from the Blackwood plantation? The historical record offers few definitive answers, but there are intriguing possibilities. Census records from Canada in the 1850s show several small communities of free black persons with unusual patterns of origin. Unlike many who escaped slavery via the Underground Railroad as individuals or small family groups, these communities arrived together, already organized with established leadership structures. One such settlement in Ontario listed among its founders a man identified as Isaiah Freeman, born Georgia. The same census records a Thomas Black living in the same community, listed as a schoolteacher. The settlement's records describe it as being governed by a written constitution establishing the equality of all residents, regardless of previous condition or origin. Is this mere coincidence or evidence of the final chapter in the Blackwood story? Without additional documentation, we cannot know with certainty. But the pattern aligns with what we know of Isaiah's vision, not merely escape from bondage, but the establishment of a new society based on fundamentally different principles. In 1957, an elderly woman claiming to be a descendant of the original Blackwood community was interviewed by a graduate student researching black settlements in Canada. The woman, then in her 90s, recalled stories told by her grandparents about their journey from Georgia to Haiti and finally to Canada. When asked about the circumstances of their departure from Georgia, she said, "They always told us it wasn't about running away. It was about walking together towards something better and bringing along those who were willing to see things differently." She added a detail that aligns remarkably with Dr. Merritt's account. "My grandmother said that before they left, they held a council where everyone had a voice, even the former master and his family. It wasn't about replacing one tyrant with another, but about finding a way for everyone to live with dignity." When asked if there had been violence involved in their liberation, the woman was emphatic. The only violence was in the system they left behind. What they created was built on something else entirely. The student's notes on this interview were never published. They were discovered among his personal papers after his death in 1985. By then, the woman he had interviewed was also deceased, and no other direct descendants of the original community could be located for verification. What are we left with then? Fragments, whispers, contradictions to the expected narrative. A story systematically erased but never completely silenced. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Blackwood case is not what occurred during those 13 days in August 1828, but what it suggests about power, resistance, and the stories we tell about both. The traditional narrative of slavery and resistance offers only binary options: submission or violent rebellion. The Blackwood case hints at a third path, one in which those deemed powerless identified leverage within a corrupt system and used it to negotiate not just their own freedom, but a fundamental reorganization of social relations. That such a story would be deliberately obscured is hardly surprising. It threatened not just the institution of slavery, but the very logic that supported it, the belief that social hierarchies were natural and immutable rather than constructed and changeable. Today, the land where the Blackwood plantation once stood bears no marker of what transpired there. The suburban development that covers it is called River's Edge, with street names that reference natural features rather than human history. Residents plant gardens and build swimming pools without knowledge of the ground beneath their feet, soil that once supported cotton harvested by enslaved hands and later possibly witnessed their liberation. In the community center of River's Edge, a small local history display mentions that the area was once agricultural land, with no reference to the plantation system or those who labored within it. The erasure continues, generation after generation, as though by unspoken agreement, yet the story persists in fragments. In the Haitian community founded by the group, now a small town with paved roads and modern amenities, children still learn the story of the Council of Equals that governed their ancestors. In the Canadian settlement, now absorbed into a larger township, a small museum preserves what they claim is the original constitution drafted by Isaiah Freeman, with its opening declaration, "We hold as self-evident the dignity of all persons created by God." And, occasionally, someone like Dr. Merritt, Elizabeth Kurthers, or Samuel Reed leaves behind an account that doesn't quite fit the official narrative, a document misfiled, overlooked, or preserved by chance that offers a glimpse of what might have been possible. In 2013, a historical preservation project in Savannah uncovered yet another fragment of the story. During the renovation of one of the city's oldest churches, workers discovered a small metal container sealed within a wall cavity. Inside was a letter dated January 1829, written by a person identifying himself only as a witness to the covenant. The letter describes a meeting held on a ship called the Deliverance before its departure from Charleston. They gathered all who would journey with them, the letter states, and asked each to affirm the principles by which they would live in their new home. Not as master and slave, not even as former master and former slave, but as persons of equal worth, united in common purpose. Some could not accept this and chose to remain behind. Others, whom one might not have expected to embrace such radical notions, stepped forward to join the company. I was moved beyond words to see former enemies clasp hands as they prepared to depart the shores of their former life. The letter concludes, "I do not know if their experiment will succeed. The weight of history and the prejudices of mankind stand against them, but I have witnessed something I had thought impossible, a glimpse of what might be if we could but see each other as fully human. I leave this testament sealed away, knowing it cannot be shared in the present climate. Perhaps in some future time, when men's hearts are more prepared to receive it, this account will find understanding ears. That future time has perhaps not yet fully arrived. Even now, the full implications of what may have occurred at the Blackwood plantation remain difficult to integrate into our understanding of American history. It is easier to believe in binary oppositions, master and slave, oppressor and oppressed, power and powerlessness, than to grapple with the complex negotiations and moral ambiguities that the fragmentary evidence suggests. What seems clear is that for 13 days in August 1828, something extraordinary occurred on 800 acres of Georgia soil. Whether through uprising, negotiation, or some combination of both, a community of people redefined their relationships to each other and imagined a different possible future. That they apparently succeeded in bringing at least some version of that future into being, despite the overwhelming odds against them, stands as a testament to what human beings can accomplish when they refuse to accept that the existing order of things is the only possible reality. The Blackwood plantation is gone now, its buildings returned to the earth, its fields covered with suburban homes. The people who lived through those 13 days have been dust for generations. But perhaps something of their vision remains, not just in the fragments of evidence they left behind, but in the very possibility they demonstrated. The possibility that even within systems designed to deny human dignity and agency, those deemed powerless can sometimes find ways to rewrite the story. And perhaps that is why the Blackwood case continues to unsettle. It reminds us that history is not a straight line, but a contested space, full of paths not taken and possibilities not realized. It suggests that power is never absolute, and that resistance takes forms we might not recognize or understand. Most disturbingly, it raises the question of how many other such stories have been systematically erased from our collective memory. How many moments of possibility that never became part of the narrative we tell ourselves about who we were and who we might become. The old oak trees that once stood witness to the events at the Blackwood plantation have mostly been cut down to make way for development. But a few remain on the edges of the property, their massive trunks and spreading branches far older than any human structure around them. They stood there in August 1828. They absorbed into their wood the sounds of that unprecedented council meeting. They witnessed whatever truly transpired in those 13 days. If trees could speak, what would they tell us about power and resistance, about fear and courage, about the human capacity to imagine beyond the boundaries of the present? What would they say about Isaiah and Thomas, about Dr. Merritt and Elizabeth Kurthers, about all those whose names we will never know, but who participated in that brief experiment in radical equality? Perhaps they would tell us simply this, that for 13 days a different world existed on that Georgia plantation, a world that was not supposed to be possible, a world systematically erased from official records but never completely forgotten, a world that continues to whisper to us across the centuries, reminding us that what is need not always be, and what has never been might still come to pass. The land remembers, even when human records are destroyed or hidden. The land holds the imprint of every footstep, every tear, every moment of courage or cowardice that transpired upon it, and sometimes, if we listen closely enough, it still speaks. In 2014, a homeowner in the River's Edge development reported an unusual discovery while digging a new garden bed in their backyard. Approximately 2 feet below the surface, they uncovered a small wooden box containing a single item, a handmade key, crafted from what appeared to be melted-down iron tools. Metallurgical analysis dated the key to the early 19th century. Accompanying the key was a small piece of paper bearing a single sentence written in faded ink. to unlock what has always been possible. The key now sits in a small display case in the Savannah History Museum, catalogued simply as Artifact Unknown Origin, c. 1820-1830. Few visitors give it a second glance as they move on to more dramatic displays. But occasionally, someone will pause before it, reading the cryptic message, perhaps wondering what door this key was meant to open, what possibilities it might have unlocked. And so the story of the Blackwood plantation remains, not fully told, not fully understood, but persistent in its refusal to be completely erased, a whisper that becomes audible in the silence between the official narratives, a question that continues to unsettle our certainties about power, resistance, and the roads not taken in our collective past. For those with ears to hear, it asks us still, what doors might we unlock? What has always